The Galactic Council didn't send generals, they sent special operations commanders. They didn't send diplomats. They sent operators. The Interstellar Monitoring Array at Lagrange Point 4 detected the anomaly at 3:47 Universal Time Coordinated on a Tuesday, which, in the judgment of everyone who later reviewed the logs, felt like entirely the wrong day for the history of humanity to change forever. It wasn't a dramatic flash. No blinding light across the solar system. The signal was a precise, modulated pulse buried inside what initially looked like background microwave noise, until the automated pattern recognition software flagged it at confidence level 99.997%. The duty officer, a 26-year-old signals analyst named Priya Mehta, read the alert, reread it, ran the manual verification herself, and then sat completely still for 47 seconds before she picked up the phone. She called the SETI Coordination Bureau's emergency line first. Then, following her protocol, she called 3 numbers she had never expected to dial in her career. The third number connected her, after 2 transfers and a voice authentication, to an office inside a nondescript building on the outskirts of Geneva, a building that officially processed agricultural trade statistics. The man who answered was named Director Elias Vorn. He listened without interrupting, asked exactly 2 clarifying questions, and then told Mehta she had done everything correctly. His voice was calm in a way she would later describe as, not the calm of someone who isn't worried, but the calm of someone who has been waiting. Because they had been waiting. Not in the breathless, optimistic way of science communicators and astronomers who appeared on documentary panels. The agencies that had been quietly preparing for non-terrestrial contact since the early 2040s had long ago stopped imagining it would feel like a gift. They had gamed the scenarios. They had run the simulations. They had read every credible paper on asymmetric civilizational encounters in history, every colonial contact, every technological disruption, every instance in which one civilization met another that possessed capabilities it could not yet measure. The signal itself, once decoded over the following 72 hours by a team of 19 linguists, mathematicians, and information theorists working in isolated relay, was not a greeting. It was a request for coordinates. Not Earth's location, they clearly already had that. The signal asked for the coordinates of humanity's decision-making authority. Translated as precisely as the team could manage, it read, "Identify the entity with whom negotiated terms may be established." That single sentence changed everything about how the response was structured. A diplomatic mission would have been sent to heads of state, to the UN Security Council, to the Secretary General's office, to the visible centers of institutional power. Every scenario planner in every government had assumed that first contact would route through those channels, and most of the early contingency frameworks reflected that assumption. But the Galactic Council, that is what the signal's origin structure implied, a multi-body governing entity comprising at minimum 11 distinct spacefaring civilizations, had not asked for Earth's capitals. They had asked for the entity that could make binding, enforceable commitments and survive the pressure of doing so. Which meant they already knew something important, that Earth's formal political architecture and Earth's actual decision-making authority were not the same thing. Director Vorn convened the Blackwater Group. Its real name has never been publicly released, within 18 hours of the decoded message. 22 individuals in a secure facility. No political appointees. No ambassadors. The group included 3 former special operations commanders from 3 different nations, 2 theoretical physicists, a behavioral economist who had spent 15 years modeling non-cooperative game theory in resource-constrained environments, a retired intelligence director, and several others whose specific roles were not logged for this account. They spent 6 hours reviewing the signal, the decoding methodology, and the implied structure of the entity that sent it. Then they spent 4 more hours on a question that no diplomatic textbook had ever seriously prepared anyone to answer. What does it mean that they didn't contact our governments? The retired intelligence director, a woman who had spent 30 years studying adversarial decision-making under conditions of radical information asymmetry, was the first to say it plainly. They didn't contact our governments because governments are the visible layer, she said. They contacted this frequency, which they would have known is monitored by people who are not accountable to press cycles or election calendars. They're not interested in our public face. They want to talk to whoever actually runs continuity planning. One of the special operations commanders, a compact, unhurried man named Ramirez whose career had taken him from mountain warfare to counterproliferation to strategic advising, leaned forward and said something that the transcript would later mark as the pivotal observation of that meeting. "They sent a message asking us to identify our operators," he said. "Not our figureheads. Our operators." That means whoever is coming to this meeting, on their side, is not a diplomat. They're sending someone who understands how decisions get made under pressure. Someone who has planned and executed under uncertainty. Someone who reads the terrain before they commit. The room was quiet for a moment. Then we send the same, said Director Vorn. Over the next 11 days, humanity prepared its response. Not a broadcast, not a press conference, not a summit. A quiet, precisely structured reply transmitted on the same modulated frequency, containing the coordinates of a location in the South Atlantic, a proposed time frame, and a single line that had been drafted, revised, argued over, and finally approved by all 22 members of the Blackwater Group. We will send those authorized to listen, assess, and commit. The Council's confirmation arrived within 6 hours. They would arrive in 41 days. The United Nations was informed 40 hours later, not consulted. Informed. The three governments whose special operations commanders sat in that room were informed simultaneously, under classification frameworks that did not officially exist. And Priya Mehta, the signals analyst who had started all of this at 3:47 on a Tuesday, was quietly transferred to a new posting she had not applied for, in a facility she had never heard of, doing work she was told she would understand the importance of in time. She understood it within the first week. The silence that followed the Council's confirmation was not the silence of nothing happening. It was the silence of everything being moved into position, carefully, without announcement, without the theater of public readiness. The world didn't know. The operators did. And they got to work. 41 days is not a long time to prepare for anything consequential. It is enough time to build a field outpost, to run a focused training rotation, to move certain assets from one hemisphere to another without drawing formal attention. It is not enough time to restructure a civilization's strategic posture, unless that restructuring had already been quietly underway for years. The Blackwater Group understood this immediately. They did not attempt the impossible. They refined what already existed. The first priority was assessment, not preparation. Before you could prepare for a meeting, you had to understand what kind of meeting it was. And the signal structure, clinical, precise, stripped of anything resembling warmth or performative goodwill, suggested that whoever was coming was not interested in ceremony. Commander Ramirez chaired the intelligence synthesis sessions. His background in special operations had given him a specific cognitive habit that proved invaluable. He did not plan for the adversary he wanted to face. He planned for the adversary that the available evidence described. The available evidence described an entity that had, at minimum, the following characteristics: the technical capability to locate and contact a specific monitoring array at L4, suggesting deep familiarity with humanity's sensor infrastructure. The operational sophistication to use modulated noise spectrum communication, suggesting prior covert observation. And the institutional patience to request a structured meeting rather than simply arriving, which suggested either genuine interest in negotiated terms, or a highly refined understanding of how to put a counterpart at ease before a high-stakes interaction. None of these characteristics were reassuring in isolation. Together, they painted a picture of an intelligence that operated with the calm professionalism of a seasoned Special Operations Command. Which meant, Ramirez noted in his assessment brief, that humanity's delegation had to demonstrate the same quality. Not power, they had no way to credibly project force at interstellar scale, and attempting to bluff would be immediately transparent to anyone competent enough to have found them. Not deference. Uncalibrated deference signals weakness in every adversarial negotiation framework across human history. What they needed to project was professional composure, the quiet, readable confidence of people who have assessed a difficult situation honestly and are prepared to engage it without flinching. The delegation was selected over 72 hours of structured evaluation. Commander Yael Dagan led the primary contact team. She was 53 years old, a veteran of counterproliferation operations across 3 continents, and, critically, a practitioner of what her evaluators described as structured patience under ambiguity. She did not fill silence with noise. She did not reach for certainty when uncertainty was the honest condition. Her operational record showed a consistent pattern. She gathered information, held judgment, and acted decisively when the picture was clear enough. Flanking her were 2 individuals whose roles were not military. Dr. Soren Tal, a xenolinguistics theorist who had spent 20 years building mathematical models for non-human communication structures, and Dr. Amara Osei, a behavioral economist whose work on non-cooperative negotiation had been applied, until now, exclusively to arms reduction frameworks. The support structure around them was larger and less visible. 12 analysts in a relay facility monitored communication feeds in real time. 6 technical specialists managed the translation and signal infrastructure. A medical team that had been briefed on what little was known about potential non-terrestrial biological risk operated from a separate facility 6 kilometers away. And surrounding all of it, at a distance that would not be apparent but could not be missed by anyone with quality surveillance capability, a quiet perimeter. No dramatic show of force. No visible military hardware in the immediate zone. Just a structured, professional presence that said, in the clearest possible operational language, "We are serious people and we have thought carefully about this." The second major task of the 41 days was information containment, not suppression but management. The governments who had been notified operated under the tightest compartmentalization frameworks in modern history. Leaks were expected, the group planned for them. 3 deliberate partial disclosures were authorized, each carefully calibrated to reduce the pressure toward unauthorized disclosure while revealing nothing operationally significant. The public received, across multiple media channels over several weeks, a gradual increase in credible-seeming coverage of unexplained signal anomalies and international scientific coordination meetings, enough to prime a framework of awareness without triggering the destabilizing cascade that a direct announcement would have caused. It was not deception exactly. It was pacing, the management of information released to minimize systemic shock. Ramirez referred to it, privately, as civilian force protection. The third task was the most technically demanding, building a communication architecture capable of supporting a real-time, bidirectional exchange with an entity whose signal processing capabilities were, by definition, more sophisticated than anything humanity had deployed. Dr. Tal's team worked backward from the Council's signal. If that signal had been designed to be decoded by humanity's existing infrastructure, which the analysis strongly suggested, then it contained implicit information about what the Council believed humanity was capable of receiving. Tal's team used those implicit parameters to build a transmission framework that would be, in his precise language, neither underpowered nor pretentious. "We don't want to show up with a tin can and string," he told the group in the final week. "But we also can't pretend to capabilities we don't have. The architecture has to be honest. Honest about our current level. And honest about the fact that we understand what level they're operating at." The meeting location had been established at a mid-ocean platform in the South Atlantic, a structure that had been constructed under cover of oceanic research operations over the preceding 4 years, built by a program that no single government had fully funded and no single intelligence service had fully overseen. It was the closest thing humanity had to a facility designed from the ground up for the possibility of non-terrestrial contact. Structurally isolated, electromagnetically shielded, accessible only by sea and air under controlled conditions, and, in a design decision that had been quietly debated for years, built to human scale rather than retrofitted for it. The message in that choice, Dagon noted during her final preparation briefing, was subtle but important. This is our environment. We designed it. We understand it. You are arriving as our guest. On the 38th day, a council signal arrived with updated approach vectors. The craft would enter the atmosphere from the southern polar corridor rather than a direct equatorial descent, a routing choice that the analysis team spent 20 hours interpreting before reaching a tentative conclusion. The polar approach minimized the number of populated observation corridors. The council was not trying to be seen on the way in. They were being considerate. That single observation shifted the tone of Dagon's final briefing. Not dramatically, she had not built her career on dramatic shifts. But the note she wrote to herself that night, on paper, in her own handwriting, was later found in her personal effects and has since been widely quoted. "They're not coming to impress us. They're coming to assess us. That means the meeting is already underway." On the morning of the 41st day, the platform was fully staffed and operationally ready. The sea was calm. The sky was clear. Dagon stood on the outer observation deck at 6 o'clock, drank coffee, and watched the southern horizon with the same unhurried focus she had brought to every difficult operation of her career. At 9:14, 3 objects crossed the horizon on a precise approach vector, moving at a speed that generated no visible wake and no detectable acoustic signature. They arrived exactly on schedule. The Council's commanders read the room before they said anything. The 3 craft that descended toward the South Atlantic platform were not what anyone had pictured. There were no vast, city-sized superstructures blotting out the sun. No dramatic heat signatures, no sonic booms, no visible propulsion systems. The objects, roughly 40 meters in length, shaped in a way that suggested function over spectacle, with surface textures that absorbed light in a manner inconsistent with known materials, settled onto the platform's designated landing area with a mechanical precision that suggested either extraordinary sensor capability or extensive prior reconnaissance. Probably both. Dr. Tal, watching from behind the observation glass, made a note that he later described as the most professionally exciting observation of his career. The craft's landing struts, extending in the final approach phase, were calibrated to exactly the load-bearing specifications of the platform surface. Specifications that had not been shared with anyone outside the construction oversight team. They had done their homework. Dagon was on the platform's outer deck with 2 members of her contact team when the forward hatch of the primary craft opened. She had positioned herself neither aggressively close nor diplomatically distant, at what her operational judgment told her was the appropriate range for an initial assessment interaction. Close enough to be readable. Far enough to be non-threatening. The kind of distance that said I am here and I am paying attention rather than I am deferring to you or I am trying to dominate this space. 3 figures emerged. They were bipedal, which had been assessed as probable but not certain. They stood between 1.9 and 2.1 meters tall. Their physical structure was not humanoid in any superficial sense. The proportions were different, the sensory anatomy was clearly distinct, and their movement pattern had a quality that Dagon's operational mind automatically catalogued as deliberate without being slow. Like people who were trained to move with purpose. The figure at the center wore no visible rank insignia, which was itself a communicative choice. Either their rank system was not visually encoded in a way that translated to human recognition, or they had chosen to arrive without displaying it. Both interpretations were significant. Dagon filed both. The center figure stopped at approximately 7 meters. The 2 flanking figures stopped 2 meters behind and slightly to the sides, an arrangement that Ramirez, watching on feed from the relay facility, immediately identified as a standard security formation adapted to a low-threat environment. They're not treating this as combat adjacent, he noted in his log. They're treating it like a command-level site visit. For 4 seconds nothing happened. Then the center figure produced a device, small, rectangular, held loosely at mid-body level, and a sound emerged from it. Not speech exactly. A structured tonal sequence that lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then a pause. Then from the same device in accented but grammatically correct English, "We read your signal. We are satisfied you sent the right people." Dr. Tal, whose translation architecture had been running continuously since the craft landed, later confirmed that the tonal sequence preceding the English was not a translation artifact. It was a separate statement, directed at the flanking figures, that his models assessed with 74% confidence as something approximating, "Posture is appropriate. Proceed." They had been evaluating the delegation's body language before they spoke. Dagon responded without pause, without deference, and without performed warmth. "We read your signal the same way," she said. "We're ready to listen." The choice of the word listen rather than talk or negotiate or welcome had been deliberated over for 3 days in the preparation sessions. Tal had proposed it. His argument was that in every communication framework his models had analyzed, entities opening a high-stakes exchange were more reassured by a counterpart who signaled receptivity than one who immediately projected agenda. Listen communicated competence, composure, and genuine information seeking. The center figure, who was later, through a long process of name rendering, referred to in transcripts as Commander Sale, gave a response that Tal's real-time system flagged as consistent with an expression of calibrated approval. Not enthusiasm. Not relief. The kind of response that a seasoned operator gives when a counterpart demonstrates they have prepared properly. They moved inside. The interior meeting space had been designed by a team that had spent 2 years thinking about this specific problem. How do you create an environment that signals organizational seriousness to an entity you cannot fully profile in advance? The room was uncluttered, with a central table built to a height that could accommodate a range of bipedal physiologies. Lighting was neutral and adjustable. Temperature was held at a range determined to be within probable tolerance for a broad category of carbon-based metabolic systems. There was no decorative element in the room that did not serve a functional purpose. The 3 council commanders sat on one side. Dagon, Tal, and Osei sat on the other. The first 90 minutes were not negotiation. They were assessment. Commander Sale's questions were precise and sequenced in a way that Osei, watching the structure of the exchange in real time, recognized as a classic capability mapping interview. Not an interrogation. An interview. The kind of structured information gathering that an experienced decision-maker conducts when they need to understand what they are actually dealing with before committing to any position. They asked about governance. Not the formal structure but the real decision latency. How long did it take for a decision made in that room to translate to implemented action? They asked about resource coordination, not GDP or economic statistics, but how quickly could humanity reallocate industrial output in response to an external variable. They asked about internal conflict management, not diplomatic framing but honest assessment. What was the current probability, in the delegation's judgment, of a coordinated unilateral action by a non-state actor within any 12-month window? Each question was delivered without apparent agenda, not accusatory, not leading. They were the questions of people building a model, not testing a hypothesis. Dagon answered each one with the same quality she had brought to the platform: honest, calibrated, unembellished. Where the answer was "we don't know," she said so. Where the answer reflected a weakness, she stated it without apology and paired it with the structural response that weakness had generated. Yes, our decision latency is longer than we would like at the formal political level. Here is the parallel structure that addresses that problem. After 47 minutes, Commander Sale paused the exchange. The tonal sequence that preceded the next statement was, in Tal's assessment, something close to a shift in register, a move from information gathering to disclosure. You should understand why we chose this approach, Sale said. We have conducted 42 prior first contact exchanges. 19 of those delegations sent heads of government. 11 sent scientific bodies. 7 sent combined diplomatic missions. In each of those cases, the initial exchange produced agreements that were later repudiated by the actual decision-making structure. The room was quiet. Those failures, Sale continued, were not the result of bad faith. They were the result of the wrong people sitting at the table. People who were chosen for visibility, not authority. Dagon held the silence for a moment before responding. And the 5. Sale's device produced a sequence that Tal flagged with moderate confidence as something equivalent to a professionally controlled pause before a significant statement. The 5 who sent the right people, Sale said, are members of the council. They weren't offering protection. They were offering a test. The revelation about the 5 civilizations who had successfully navigated first contact, and the 37 who had not, sat in the room for a long moment before anyone spoke. Dagon was the one who broke the silence, and she did it the right way, not with a reaction but with a clarifying question. When you say those 5 are members of the council, she said, what does membership require? It was the right question. Not what are the benefits of membership, not what are the terms, but what does it require? The framing communicated something important, that the delegation was thinking about commitment and capacity before advantage. Commander Sale responded with what Tal's real-time analysis assessed as a genuine shift in the meeting's atmosphere. A slight relaxation in the structured formality that had defined the first hour. Membership requires, Sale said, demonstrated capacity to maintain stable governance across a multi-generational horizon, to manage internal conflict without civilizational disruption, and to coordinate with entities whose threat and benefit calculus does not map to your own. He paused. The third requirement is the one that eliminates most candidates. Dr. Osei, who had been largely quiet through the first session, spoke for the first time. Because most civilizations, when they encounter a radically different threat and benefit calculus, default to projection. They assume the other entity wants what they would want, or fears what they would fear. Sale looked at her, the first time any of the 3 council figures had directed sustained focus at someone other than Dagon. That is precisely correct, he said. It was the first moment in the exchange where something resembling intellectual engagement replaced pure assessment. Osei had identified a structural truth from the outside that the council had apparently learned through 42 encounters from the inside. The gap between those two positions, observed externally versus learned operationally, was not large, but it was real, and Sale's response acknowledged it. The next 3 hours covered what the council described as the current strategic landscape, a term that turned out to encompass something considerably more complex than any of the contingency planning had modeled. The council was not, as the science fiction frameworks of the prior century had imagined, a stable, peaceful federation of enlightened civilizations managing the galaxy's affairs from a position of benevolent superiority. It was, in Osei's subsequent analytical summary, a managed tension architecture, an alliance structure built explicitly on the acknowledgement that its members had fundamentally incompatible long-term interests, and that the only alternative to the council's framework was direct conflict that none of its members could afford. Think of it less like the United Nations, Osei wrote in her assessment, and more like a nuclear non-proliferation treaty among parties who genuinely despise each other and have excellent reasons to maintain the agreement anyway. The Council wanted humanity as a member for reasons that were, once explained, entirely unsentimental. Humanity occupied a solar system at a gravitational junction, a point in the galactic structure where three separate interstellar transit corridors converged. That transit junction was currently unclaimed and undefended. Within the Council's strategic projection models, it would become a point of contention between two of its members within approximately 60 to 80 years, a timeline that, for civilizations operating on multi-century planning horizons, was immediate. A member civilization with legitimate sovereignty over that junction, willing to maintain it under Council oversight, would stabilize the dispute before it became a crisis. The Council was not looking for humanity to project force into the galaxy. They were looking for humanity to exist, stably and verifiably, at a strategically important location. "We are not," Sale said with careful deliberateness, "asking you to become something you are not. We are asking you to be what you already are with better information." The delegation spent 40 minutes processing the implications. The strategic logic was clear enough. The operational challenge was significant. Membership, as the requirements described it, demanded a level of internal governance stability and conflict management capability that humanity, in honest assessment, did not consistently demonstrate. The planet's history of civilizational disruption, wars, institutional collapse, cascading failures of international coordination, was not hidden from the Council. They had clearly been observing long enough to have built a thorough picture. Dagon asked the question that the entire delegation had been working around. "You've assessed our history. You know our instability patterns. Why are you here?" Sale's response was the most operationally significant thing said in the entire first day of talks. "Because your instability is endogenous," he said. "It arises from internal resource competition and governance failures that are structurally correctable. We have encountered civilizations whose instability is exogenous, driven by factors outside their system. Those civilizations cannot be stabilized by membership. You can." He paused. "Also, you sent the right people. That is not as common as you might assume." The second gap, the one no one in the delegation had anticipated, emerged toward the end of the afternoon session, when the Council's third commander, who had been largely silent and whose role had not been fully parsed by Tal's analysis, produced a separate document set and placed it on the table. This was the technical assessment of humanity's current defensive capability relative to the threats that transited the junction corridors. The delegation reviewed it in silence. The numbers were not catastrophic. They were, in the careful language of Osei's subsequent brief, honestly concerning, a phrase she had chosen specifically to avoid both panic and false reassurance. Humanity's current military and technological posture was, relative to the entities that regularly used those transit corridors, approximately comparable to a well-organized mid-level power encountering a peer competitor for the first time. Not helpless. Not invincible. Capable, within limits, with significant vulnerabilities that were identifiable and, critically, addressable. "We are not here to hand you a solution," Sale said. "We are here to tell you what the problem actually looks like from outside your system, and to offer the framework through which you could develop your own solution." Ramirez, listening on feed in the relay facility, said one word to the colleague beside him: respect. He did not mean it as a compliment to the Council. He meant it as a professional assessment. They were running this engagement the same way any experienced Special Operations Command would run an advisory mission to a partner force. Honestly scoped, structurally patient, focused on building capability rather than creating dependency. The gap between what humanity needed to be and what humanity currently was would not be closed by the Council. It would be closed by humanity with the Council's framework and information, on humanity's own operational timeline. The meeting ended for the day at 1947 local time. No agreements had been signed. No commitments had been made. But as Dagon walked back to her quarters across the platform deck in the clear evening air, she did something she rarely did at the end of a high-stakes operational day. She permitted herself a single, quiet thought that was not strategic. "We are not alone, and the people who found us thought we were worth finding." She wrote nothing down. She told no one. The next morning they got back to work. Every civilization that got it wrong made the same mistake. Were we about to make it too? The historical record of the Council's prior first contact exchanges was not provided as a courtesy. It was provided as a calibration tool, a structured body of evidence that Commander Sale delivered on the second morning with the same matter-of-fact tone as senior instructor uses when presenting case studies to officers in an advanced training course. "These are the failures. Study them. Not so you can avoid the same mistakes, though that is useful, but so you understand why those mistakes were made, because the conditions that produced them have not changed. The briefing package was dense. Tal and Osei worked through it in parallel during the early morning session while Dagon conducted a separate conversation with the Council's third commander, the Technical Assessment Officer, about the specific characteristics of the transit junction. What Tal and Osei found in the 37 failure cases was not a diverse collection of independent errors. It was a pattern. The same pattern, expressed differently by different civilizations in different contexts, with the same structural outcome each time. Every civilization that had failed to achieve stable council membership, or had achieved it and then lost it, had made a specific category of error at the transitional phase. They had attempted to negotiate from the identity they aspired to have rather than the identity they actually had. The aspiration was always some version of the same thing, to be seen as a peer, as an equal among the stars, as a civilization that had transcended its origins and arrived at the galactic table fully formed, worthy of respect on its own terms. The problem was not the aspiration. The problem was the pretense, the performance of a capability, stability, or unity that did not yet exist. And the Council, having conducted 42 of these exchanges over an extended period, had developed a thorough and reliable methodology for detecting that pretense within the first hours of engagement. When they detected it, they withdrew. Not aggressively. Not punitively. They simply concluded that the civilization was not ready for the structural requirements of membership, thanked the delegation for its time, and departed. In 15 of the 37 cases, they returned when conditions changed. In 11 they did not return within the period the record covered. Osei's analysis of the pretense pattern was precise and, in her own assessment, uncomfortable to write. The civilizations that had performed peer-level confidence they did not possess had not done so from malice or strategic cunning. They had done it from the same psychological mechanism that drives every intelligent social entity to present its best self in a high-stakes evaluation, the fear that honest self-assessment would be read as weakness and would eliminate the possibility of the outcome they needed. The irony, which the Council records documented with almost clinical thoroughness, was that honest self-assessment was exactly what the Council was evaluating for. Not capability, capability could be developed. Not stability, stability could be built. The fundamental test of Council membership suitability was whether a civilization's leadership could accurately perceive and honestly represent their own condition under high-stakes external pressure. They were testing for self-awareness, Tal said, when he and Osei compared notes during the midday break. More specifically, Osei replied, they were testing for honest self-awareness under conditions that create strong incentives to perform instead. Any governance structure can be honest when the stakes are low. The question is whether it's honest when honesty feels dangerous. Dagon, when they briefed her over lunch, absorbed the analysis quietly. Then she said, which is why they specifically asked for the people who make real decisions, rather than the people who perform decisions. Tal nodded. Political performance under pressure defaults to projection. Operational decision-making under pressure defaults to accurate assessment. They wanted the latter. The second major finding from the failure cases was more operationally specific, and it was the one that Ramirez flagged as highest priority when the relay facility received the briefing summary. 8 of the 37 failures had not been due to pretense during the initial exchange. They had been due to internal breakdown after a successful initial exchange. The civilization's delegation had performed appropriately, negotiations had advanced, and then a domestic political or military faction, either uninformed about the contact or opposed to its terms, had taken unilateral action that invalidated the negotiating framework. In 3 of those cases, the unilateral action was a military event. In 2, it was a political coup that replaced the authorized delegation with one that repudiated the prior exchanges. In the remaining 3, it was something more diffuse and harder to manage. A public disclosure event that triggered mass social destabilization severe enough to make the governance structure incapable of honoring its commitments. The Council did not have a punitive response to these events. They simply noted them, withdrew, and waited to see whether the civilization restabilized into a condition that could support resumed engagement. 3 of those 8 are in current resumed engagement, Sale noted when the delegation raised the failure cases in the afternoon session. The other 5 have not yet restabilized. He paused. The translation system rendered his next sentence with a slight quality that Tal flagged as something close to deliberate wait. The window for resumed engagement does not remain open indefinitely. The delegation understood the implication without requiring it to be spelled out. Not a threat. Not a deadline. An honest structural statement about resource allocation. The Council's attention was finite, the number of potential member civilizations in the accessible range was not, and a civilization that repeatedly demonstrated instability at the critical juncture would eventually be assessed as a lower priority engagement than one in a more developmentally stable phase. Dagon spent the final hour of the afternoon session walking Sale through what she characterized as humanity's honest instability profile, the actual current risk landscape for each of the failure categories his records had identified. Governance fracture risk, non-state unilateral action probability, public disclosure management capability, internal military discipline across the relevant command structures. It was, in the strictest sense, the most sensitive strategic information any human being had ever presented to a non-human entity. She presented it because the framework demanded it, because anything less would have been detected, and because, in her operational judgment, the Council had already assessed most of it from external observation, and the value of confirming their model with primary source honesty outweighed the risk of providing information they did not already have. Sale listened to the entire assessment without interruption. Then he said something that neither Tal nor Osei could fully parse in real time, but that the subsequent analysis consistently rendered as a specific and meaningful distinction. You are the first delegation in 11 exchanges to include the instability risks you are not managing yet, alongside the ones you are. That is a significant differentiator. Dagon nodded once. We found it more useful to be clear about the gaps than to present a picture that would require revision later. Yes, said Sale. We know. That evening in the relay facility, Ramirez updated his operational log with a note that he later said captured everything about where the engagement stood at the midpoint. Day 2 summary: we have not secured anything. We have not agreed to anything. What we have done is pass the test that 37 other civilizations failed. The question now is whether the test we've passed is the harder one or the easier one. He sat with that question for a long time before closing his log. He did not write an answer. The agreement wasn't a treaty. It was a framework for becoming one. On the third morning, Commander Sale opened the session without preamble. We are prepared to discuss terms, he said. The shift in register was immediately apparent to everyone in the room. The assessment phase was over. What followed would be operational, specific, consequential, and binding in ways that the preceding exchange had not been. Dagon had prepared for this with the same methodology she applied to any high-stakes commitment negotiation. She had identified, in order of priority, the 3 things humanity could offer, the 3 things humanity would not be able to deliver in the near term, and the 3 things humanity would need from any viable agreement. She had also identified, and this was the discipline that her career had instilled, the 3 things that would feel like concessions but were not, and the 3 that would feel like minor details but were not. The terms the Council presented were structured across 4 categories. The first was sovereignty confirmation. The Council would formally recognize Earth's governance authority over the Sol system and the adjacent space within a defined perimeter. In exchange, humanity would commit to maintaining monitoring infrastructure at the transit junction and reporting corridor traffic to the Council's observation network. No enforcement role, no capacity to interdict, just observation and reporting. You're asking us to be a listening post, Dagon said. We are asking you to be an informed neighbor, Sale replied. The distinction matters. It did matter, and Osei caught it immediately. A listening post implied passive instrumentalization, humanity as a sensor array without agency. An informed neighbor implied mutual interest alignment, humanity as a stakeholder who chose to share information because shared information was in their own interest. The framing carried implicit implications for how the relationship would develop over time. The second term was capacity development. The Council would provide access to what Sale described as framework knowledge, not technology, but the structural understanding of how the transit corridor environment worked, what threats operated in it, what the viable response doctrines for a civilization at humanity's current capability level looked like. Humanity would develop its own response capability from that framework. Ramirez, listening on feed, recognized the model immediately. It was an advisory relationship, precisely scoped. The Council would not build humanity's defense capacity. They would provide the operational picture that made it possible for humanity to build its own, correctly oriented, without the decades of trial and error that had characterized human military development in the past. The third term was the one that required the most negotiation, and the one that Osei had flagged in advance as the likely point of friction. The Council required what Sale called governance continuity assurance, a mechanism by which the commitments made in this exchange would survive changes in human political leadership. Not a guarantee of stable government, which was not achievable, but a structural mechanism that ensured the agreement persisted through the normal cycles of political transition. Dagon asked how other member civilizations had addressed this requirement. The answers varied considerably. Some had constitutional amendments. Some had parallel command structures deliberately insulated from electoral cycles. Some had international treaty architectures that made the agreement enforceable across multiple governments simultaneously. What none of them had done was simply trust that successive governments would honor their predecessors' commitments. The Council had learned that lesson in 11 of the 37 failure cases and built the requirement into the standard framework thereafter. The delegation spent 90 minutes working through the governance continuity problem. It was not straightforward. Humanity's political architecture was fragmented, diverse, and resistant to exactly the kind of supranational commitment structure the Council's requirement implied. The gap between what was institutionally achievable and what the Council needed was real. Osei ultimately proposed the solution, drawing on her background in arms verification frameworks. Rather than a single governing body responsible for maintaining the agreement, which was politically untenable across humanity's current state system, she proposed a distributed verification architecture. A network of national commitments, each individually enforceable under domestic law, collectively redundant against any single government's failure or withdrawal. If any three of a defined set of 20 major signatories remained in compliance, the agreement remained active. No single political event could break it. No coup, no election, no internal crisis could produce the kind of total repudiation that had invalidated agreements in 8 of the failure cases. Sale was quiet for a long time after Osei presented the framework. Then he turned to the third council commander, the technical assessment officer, and a brief exchange passed between them in the tonal language that Tal's system could parse only partially. What the system did catch, with 81% confidence, was an expression consistent with something like, "This is a more sophisticated governance solution than we modeled for them." When Sale turned back, "We accept the framework in principle," he said. Subject to technical review of the verification architecture. The fourth term was the one no one in the delegation had anticipated, and the one that Dagon would later describe as the moment where I understood what kind of organization we were actually dealing with. The Council requested that humanity nominate 2 individuals to serve as permanent liaisons to the Council's operations coordination body, not diplomatic representatives, not political appointees, but what Sale described as operational contacts. People who could be reached directly, who had genuine decision authority, and who the Council could treat as the human end of an ongoing working relationship rather than a ceremonial channel. The Council would also nominate 2 of their own to serve as liaisons to whatever human body was designated as the primary coordination structure. "You want a direct line to operators," Dagon said. "We want a direct line to people who make things happen," Sale said. "We have embassies with 31 civilizations. We have effective working relationships with 8. The difference is whether the line reaches the people who actually know what is occurring and can actually move resources." The nomination of the human liaisons was not resolved at the table. It would require consultation with the Blackwater Group and, eventually, with the national governments whose cooperation the verification architecture required. But the principle was agreed. By early afternoon, the 4 categories of terms had been accepted in framework, not signed, not enacted, but accepted as the structure within which a formal agreement would be developed. The session broke for a procedural recess. Dagon walked to the platform's outer railing and stood looking at the ocean for a while. Tal found her there 20 minutes later and stood beside her without speaking for a moment. "How do you think it went?" he finally asked. Dagon considered the question with the same careful attention she brought to everything. "I think," she said, "that we got what we needed and gave up what we could afford to give up. Which is the definition of a functional agreement." She paused. "I also think we were being evaluated the entire time, including today, and that the governance continuity framework was the actual test. Not whether we could produce it. Whether we could produce it without being asked." Tal frowned. "Osei proposed it because the Council required it." "The Council required governance continuity assurance," Dagon said. "They didn't specify the mechanism. The mechanism was ours. They wanted to know if we could solve a hard governance problem under pressure with an approach they hadn't seen before." She turned and walked back inside. "I think we did." The formal documentation of the framework terms took 11 days after the Council's departure. Not 11 days of continuous drafting, but 11 days of the kind of careful, deliberate work that Dagon's team had been trained to do, checking every assumption, validating every mechanism, stress-testing every element of the governance continuity architecture against the realistic scenarios in which it would need to hold. OSE ran 37 simulations of the verification network under different political stress conditions. In 34 of them the framework held. In 2 it degraded but did not collapse. In 1, a scenario involving simultaneous governmental crises in 5 of the 20 major signatories within a single 18-month window, it failed. She flagged the failure scenario, noted its probability as low but non-negligible, and recommended a structural modification that added 2 additional redundancy layers to the outer verification ring. The modification was accepted. The 37th simulation was rerun. The framework held. This was how the work was done. Not with confidence that everything would be fine, but with the professional discipline of people who understood that the alternative to careful preparation was not a smooth ride. It was the same fate as 37 other civilizations who had gotten this far and then lost what they had built. The Blackwater group reconvened in full on the 12th day. Director Vorn presented the framework summary to the 22 members. The session lasted 14 hours. Every element was examined. Several were revised. The governance continuity architecture was the longest discussion. 7 hours for significant revisions, 1 near breakdown that was resolved at 3 in the morning by a compromise that OSE would later describe as the ugliest solution that actually worked, which is often the best kind. By the end of the session, the framework had a shape that was, in Vorn's assessment, not what anyone in this room would have designed from scratch, but something that could survive contact with the real world. Which was, in the context of what they were building, the highest possible standard. The process of bringing national governments into the architecture began the following week. This was, in the judgment of everyone involved, the most operationally delicate phase of the entire engagement. More delicate in some ways than the contact itself. Because the contact had been conducted by people who understood the stakes and had the professional discipline to navigate them. The governmental consultation process required explaining those stakes to people who were not in that category, many of whom had strong institutional reasons to want a different kind of authority over what had just happened. The briefings were carefully structured. The political case was made on its merits, without manipulation and without withholding material facts. Each government was told exactly what had occurred, what the council wanted, what humanity had agreed in principle, and what their participation in the verification architecture would require of them. Some resisted. 2 walked out of initial briefings before the first session was complete. 4 demanded renegotiation of terms that had already been agreed with the council and could not be unilaterally revised. Dagon handled each of these personally, traveling to 4 capitals in 8 days, repeating the same core message with the same patient precision each time. You are not being asked to subordinate your sovereignty. You are being asked to make a commitment that protects it. The alternative is not that you retain freedom of action. The alternative is that the junction dispute that is coming in 60 years arrives without any framework for managing it, and then nobody's sovereignty is secure. By the end of the consultation period, 18 of the 20 required signatories had committed. The 19th committed after a 3-week domestic political delay. The 20th took 4 months and a change of government. But it committed. The verification architecture went live on a quiet Tuesday, same day of the week as the signal, which Tal noted in his personal log with what he described as probably meaningless but notable symmetry. The Council's technical review team confirmed its operational parameters via the relay frequency. No ceremony. No press conference. A simple technical confirmation that the mechanism was active and the framework was in effect. The 2 human liaisons were nominated 6 weeks later. Dagon was one. The second was a strategic advisor from the Blackwater Group whose name has not been publicly released, for reasons that remain operationally sound. The Council's 2 liaisons arrived, not by the dramatic craft that had landed on the South Atlantic platform, but via a compact single-occupant vessel that docked at an orbital station humanity had quietly expanded over the preceding months. They introduced themselves with the same calibrated professionalism that had characterized the entire engagement. No performance. No ceremony. Just 2 operators who had been given a working relationship to manage and intended to manage it well. The nature of what humanity had actually entered took time to fully absorb, even for the people closest to it. It was not a protection agreement. The Council was explicit that its framework did not extend to military defense of member civilizations' home systems. That responsibility remained humanity's own, informed now by the operational picture the Council had provided. It was not a resource agreement, no transfer of technology, no access to materials or systems outside the framework knowledge the Council had committed to share. What it was, in the clearest operational terms, was a context agreement. Humanity now knew what it was in the middle of. It knew the shape of the strategic environment it occupied, the nature of the transit junction it was responsible for, the realistic capability gap it needed to close, and, critically, the standards by which the entities it would need to work with over the coming decades would evaluate its reliability as a partner. That knowledge was not comfortable. In several respects, it was deeply sobering. The capability gap was real and would take decades to address. The governance continuity architecture, while functional, was fragile in ways that required ongoing maintenance. The risk of a unilateral destabilization event, the failure mode that had broken 8 of the 37, remained non-negligible. But the knowledge was accurate. And accurate knowledge of a difficult situation, Dagon had always believed, was categorically better than comfortable ignorance of the same situation. She said as much in the only public statement she ever made about the contact. Not a press conference, not a documentary interview, but a brief written note that was eventually released years later as part of the historical archive. "We were not chosen because we were powerful," she wrote. "We were not chosen because we were stable or peaceful or technologically advanced. We were chosen because, when the moment arrived, we were honest about what we were, and the people we sent to that table were honest in the right way at the right level about the right things. The galaxy does not reward pretense. It rewards accurate self-assessment and the discipline to act on it. We are not, by that standard, an exceptional species. We are a competent one at a critical moment. The work of becoming something more than that is ours to do." Commander Ramirez, reading the statement in his operational quarters, added a single line to his log. "That's the job. Always has been." He closed the log. Outside his window, the South Atlantic was calm and bright in the afternoon sun, and the monitoring array at L4 was collecting data, and somewhere in the transit corridors that converged on their unremarkable solar system, the future was already in motion. Humanity had not conquered it, had not been saved by it, had not been overwhelmed by it. They had, at the first moment of genuine contact with a larger universe, conducted themselves with the one quality that the entire experience had proven to be the most valuable and the most rare. They had been clear-eyed. And in a galaxy full of civilizations that had failed that particular test, being clear-eyed at the right moment turned out to be more than enough.